What would happen if a CEO returned to the very cafe he founded, but no one recognized him? The coffee cup trembled in Ethan Rourke's hand. Fingers once calloused from building this cafe now stiffened like a rookie on his first day. The tray tilted slightly, and a drop of black espresso slipped off, crashing onto the tiled floor, spreading into a dark stain. The air inside the cafe froze. A spoon clinked against a table. Then came the voice, cold as steel against bare skin. "One more time and it's coming out of your paycheck, Eli." Ethan stood still, not because of the spilled coffee, but because of what hid beneath that sentence. He didn't look up, but something inside him cracked. A moment of silence stretched thin before the espresso grinder screeched again and the world resumed. But Ethan didn't. He kept staring at the coffee on the floor, not just a mess, but a distorted symbol of something he had once poured his heart into. This place used to be breath itself, a warm fire for those who had never known kindness. The Ember Cup. The first cafe he and Camille built was born from student loans, sleepless nights scrubbing floors until they could barely stand, from every cappuccino poured with two burned, tired hands. No one but the two of them believed a tiny corner cafe could become a refuge for people missing both money and faith. Ethan didn't just open a business, he cultivated a soul for it. Every wall held photos of regulars. Every chipped ceramic mug was chosen for its imperfect beauty. He trained his staff like family, led by listening more than instructing, so they'd take home not just a paycheck, but a sense of dignity. Yet today, returning as Eli, a nameless new hire, all he saw were harsh lights, forced smiles, stilted voices, and a silence so heavy it felt like someone had dropped something precious and no one cared to pick it up. Pinned to his chest was a plastic tag that read, Eli. A name he had never been called, until the moment he decided to come back to the place that had once meant everything disguised as a stranger. Ethan remembered clearly the red ribbon on opening day, Camille's hand shaking as she held the scissors, and her smile when she whispered, "This place carries your soul." Among mismatched chairs, borrowed tables, and sunlight slanting through the windows, they made only one promise, to build something real, not perfect, just true. But after Camille passed away, Ethan could no longer bear to be behind the counter. Every time he wiped a table, he saw her smiling there. Every cup he poured echoed her voice. "Did you add the cinnamon this morning?" Eventually, he stepped away, not in surrender, but because the void she left was too vast. He handed the cafe over to Dax, a skilled former barista who once said, "I learned this craft because of you." Ethan believed him. Believed Dax understood this wasn't just a place that sold coffee, but a promise made in steam and warmth. But 2 years later, whispers began to spread. Regulars disappeared. Online reviews thinned out, filled with words like soulless, lost its charm, rushed. Ethan tried to reassure himself. Every cafe has slow seasons. Until a supplier called, frustrated the staff wouldn't accept deliveries on time. Others said, Dax never shows his face. One afternoon, Ethan returned unannounced, sat in his old corner. No one greeted him. No eyes lit up in recognition. The coffee was so bitter he couldn't finish it. He left quietly, but the sense of unease clung to him. That night, standing before the mirror, he shaved for the first time in 7 years. In his hand was a blank name tag and a pen. He wrote, Eli. It looked strange, but it felt right. The old apron embroidered with Ethan Rourke was folded and put away. In its place, a faded blue apron like everyone else's. He stared at his reflection. No more fire in his eyes, only a stillness, deeper than silence. But within that stillness, something stirred. He hadn't come back to reminisce. He came back to face the truth, and to find out what had truly rotted from within. The bell above the door rang as Ethan stepped in for his first morning as Eli, a trainee with no backstory, no expectations, no trace in any file. The scent of coffee was the same as ever, rich, warm, with a hint of cinnamon in every breath. But as Ethan looked around, he sensed something was off. The tables were lined up in rigid, lifeless rows, the cups all identical, as if stamped out from some sterile mold. Gone were the patched ceramic mugs, the chalk drawings on the menu board. What was once a chaotic but living symphony had turned into the hush of a laboratory. A male employee mopped the floor without looking up. Another barista keyed in orders, eyes glazed like a machine. Ethan used to feel the heartbeat of the cafe and the staff's every move now. All that remained were the dull rhythms of repetition. He stepped up to the counter. A voice spoke without looking. "New hire?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, Eli." The girl pointed toward a coat rack. "Hang your stuff there. Dax will show you the ropes." No greeting, no smile, not a trace of warmth. Ethan quietly walked to the back area. No one looked his way. No one paused. The whole place felt pre-programmed to finish tasks without forging any connection. One barista adjusted the milk shelf, earbuds still in. Another bumped into him and walked on like he wasn't there. Then a voice spoke, soft but not detached. "First day?" Ethan turned. A girl with tired eyes that hadn't dimmed her name was Mara. He barely managed a "yeah" before another voice cut in, sharp and cold. "Eli, right?" Dax appeared. Same confident posture, purposeful stride, a smile seemingly printed on but without warmth. "Keep up. No one's holding hands around here." Mara looked down and returned to her tasks, the kindness from earlier now withdrawn, like a flame snuffed out. Dax pointed at the espresso machine. "Steam the milk." Ethan nodded. This machine was newer, clearly upgraded, with no labels or instructions. He carefully adjusted the wand, but moved a bit slowly. The sound of steaming milk rang awkwardly, uneven. Dax sighed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is basic stuff. Ever worked in a cafe before?" Ethan said nothing. He knew the inner workings of older machines. He had personally picked each one, but not this. Not the efficiency-optimized generation Dax had once suggested before Ethan stepped away. He tried again, his hand trembling slightly. The milk pitcher tilted, his grip unsure, and before he could correct it, Dax stepped in and nudged him aside. "If you need me to hold your hand, just say so." The words came with exaggerated flair. It wasn't instruction, it was dominance. Not feedback, just judgment. Dax finished the milk with a flashy flourish, then walked off without a word. Ethan picked up a towel and quietly wiped down the table near the window. A customer sat reading, oblivious. Inside Ethan, something churned. It wasn't the scolding that unsettled him, not the misstep with the machine. It was how no one reacted to the public humiliation. Not a single look of protest. No one stepped in. But he knew they saw it, fleeting glances from behind the counter, hands that hesitated for just a beat. The pressure here wasn't loud. It lived in held breaths and silent turnings away. Ethan had once believed that simply holding onto original values would be enough. But he was wrong. Values don't survive on their own. They must be protected, fought for, and breathed into every day. And it seemed that in the time he had been gone, no one had the strength left to do that. He stood up, still holding the towel, his back slightly bent, eyes downcast. His whole body like a fabric heavy with time. But in his chest, the memory of Camille still burned, and the quiet things she used to say beside the counter. "People come for the coffee, but they stay for the truth." Ethan took a deep breath. There was no doubt anymore. The truth had been lost, and he couldn't stay silent any longer. The afternoon light spilled slowly through the cafe window, casting long shadows across the gray tile floor. Ethan remained at his familiar station by the side counter, carefully wiping down each edge of the tables, adjusting sugar packets as though arranging fragments of memory. At the ember cup, every movement once carried its own rhythm, a silent pulse full of life. Now, everything had become passive motion in a soulless space. Dax stepped out from the back, holding a half-finished cappuccino, eyes glued to his wristwatch. He scanned the room, then spotted Ethan adjusting chairs near the window. "We closing early or something?" His voice shot out like an arrow. Ethan looked up. "I was just not working." Dax cut him off, his half-smile sharp with warning. "Here, we clean up after the last customer leaves. Not before." He enunciated each word like a lesson taught to a careless child. Ethan nodded, bowing his head lower than necessary, not in surrender, but to listen. To hear the sounds that weren't spoken aloud, the short sigh from the barista by the espresso machine, the soft clink of a spoon in a glass from Mara, the only one whose inner flame hadn't entirely gone out. No one said a word, but every pair of eyes turned away, as if programmed to avoid trouble. Ethan retreated to the back, still clutching the cleaning cloth, not yet wrung dry. Isolation didn't need to shout. It lived in twisted glances and complicit silence. He once believed a good workplace was where people were free to speak up. But here, every voice seemed strangled before it could find breath. The next morning, Dax called a quick meeting at the Espresso bar before anyone was fully awake. Hands gripped cold coffee cups, eyes dulled by fatigue. Dax entered with the stance of a keynote speaker, hands in pockets, shoulders angled, voice brighter than usual. "We don't run on caffeine. We run on energy." He circled the staff like they were his audience at a motivational seminar. "Negative vibes don't survive here. Keep things light, agile, upbeat, or step aside." No one answered. Only Mara shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her jaw tightening slightly. Dax stopped in the center of the circle. "Customers don't just come for coffee. They come for the feeling." He clapped his hands loud, abrupt, out of sync. "Let's get to it." As the group dispersed, Ethan didn't walk away right away. A phrase echoed in his mind not from Dax, but from Camille. "People come here for the truth, not theatrics." Dax's polished slogans felt like a firewall hiding a system already hollowed out. Then a moment passed like cold wind across a collar. Mara handed a latte to a customer. "I ordered almond milk, not oat." The customer frowned. Mara froze. I'm sorry." But before she could finish, Dax swooped in like a blade. "I'll take care of it." His voice soft to the customer, but razor sharp as he turned to Mara. "We double-check orders, always, no exceptions." Mara bowed her head. No defense. No one stepped in. Ethan watched from the back, his eyes fixed on Mara's face. Her shoulders tensed, breath held tight in her chest. And for the first time since returning, Ethan saw clearly what he had tried so hard to avoid, that the very place he had once sweat for, poured his soul into, had now become a place where people learned to hide their tears quickly and quietly so no one would notice. But he noticed. And he would not let it be wiped away like a coffee stain scrubbed off a table. Not this time. Not when the masks were beginning to crack. The cold storage room was the only place in the cafe where no voices echoed. Inside there was only the hum of the compressor and the soft rustling of plastic as someone brushed past the shelves. Ethan stepped in to grab some milk, but before the door closed behind him, he froze. Bathed in the pale green glow of the fluorescent light, Mara stood leaning against the storage rack. Her arms were crossed, head slightly bowed, hair falling over one side of her face. Her shoulders trembled gently, like waves breaking against a silent wall. No sobs, no cries, just the quiet collapse of someone who had tried too long to hold her shape together. Her apron was still on, her hands still clean, but her eyes were red, glistening with tears. She wiped them quickly, once, then again, as if trying to erase the evidence before emotion could leave a trace. Ethan quietly stepped back out, making no sound. No one else saw. No one asked. But to him, that moment felt like a small blade piercing a part of his memory he had clung to as intact this place had once been a refuge. A place where people like Mara walked in weary and left with lighter shoulders. Now they hid their tears behind steel doors, among tubs of ice cream and cartons of milk, where cold was expected and indifference was the unspoken rule. Ethan thought of all the people who had once worked here, the laughter, the inside jokes after closing, the shared mochas at the end of a shift. Where had it all gone? That afternoon, he found Mara by the sink, scrubbing a milk pitcher with more force than necessary. Foam splashed against the basin's edge, her hands moving as though scrubbing away something nameless. He approached, saying nothing at first. After a slow pause, he asked, "You okay?" Mara didn't look up. "I'm fine." Her voice was curt, clipped, then slower. "That happens all the time." She rinsed the pitcher, drying it with one hand. "I used to get really angry. Now," she shrugged, "I just shut down and wait for the shift to end." She tried to smile, a weak, practiced smile, more reflex than emotion, a way to hide the spreading cracks. Ethan nodded gently. He didn't push. But in his eyes, her endurance was both powerful and dangerous, because once someone learns to swallow their anger instead of being heard, they start believing they're not worth compassion. Mara glanced at him briefly, her eyes still tired. "You'll get used to it. Around here, you either adapt or you break." Her words didn't carry drama. They came out like a mundane truth, cold as the chill in the storage room. Then she returned to her task, softly humming a tune too quiet to recognize. Ethan didn't ask more. He just stood there, quietly tracing the breath of a sorrow that had turned into routine. What haunted him wasn't just the rot in the culture here, but the fact that he had once left, allowing people like Mara to face it all alone. On the break room bulletin board, a new message appeared in red marker. Dax stood before it, still holding the pen, eyes sharp like a blade. "Starting next week, we're rolling out a new performance evaluation system," he announced, as if offering a reward. No one responded. "KPIs, energy, attitude, and customer impression." Mara blinked. Someone coughed quietly. Ethan kept his gaze lowered. "If you fall short twice in a week," Dax continued, "you lose 5% of your pay." He smiled, thinking this would be motivating. "Not asking much, just stay cheerful. Do your job well. That's how you keep your full pay." No one protested. Not a single eye dared look up. Ethan stood there, hearing a truth colder than the freezer. From now on, fear had been formalized, and tears now had a place to hide. It was just that no one cared whether they still flowed. Rain began to fall near the end of the shift, streaking the glass door as if trying to blur the line between inside and out. The cafe lights grew dim and hazy, reflecting off the wet tiles near the entrance. A rush delivery order came in through the app, but the scheduled driver never showed. Dax looked around, squinting in irritation, then pointed without hesitation. "Mara, you run this one." She froze, eyes drifting toward the rain pouring down beyond the awning. "It's really coming down out there." Dax shrugged. "So you want the customer to cancel, and we lose the whole order?" Mara said nothing. No raincoat, no protection. Just a thin, worn hoodie pulled up loosely over her head. She hugged the delivery tray tightly to her chest and dashed through the door. The glass trembled slightly from the force of the wind as it slammed behind her. Ethan stood tucked beside the display shelf, watching everything unfold unnoticed. He counted the minutes. 5, then 7. Then the chime above the door rang again as Mara returned, still clutching the now empty tray, shoulders soaked, her hair clinging to her skin like pressed strands. One cheek was scraped red, streaked with rain and grime. She had likely fallen, but she said nothing, didn't stop. She walked straight to the sink, placed the tray down, and began wiping it clean as if she had never left. Dax remained at the end of the counter, eyes locked on his phone, not lifting his head, not asking a thing. Ethan felt his anger rising, but it didn't ignite. It clenched, hard, into a frozen stone in his chest. Not because of the rain, not because of Mara's bruised cheek, but because of how normal it all felt, a person sent into a storm and returning as if they were never human at all. Later, Ethan brought a cappuccino to table 4. Alda, a silver-haired regular with a tidy knit sweater and a half-finished crossword, looked up as he set the cup down. "Thank you, dear," she said gently. Then her eyes lingered on him longer than necessary. "You've worked here before, haven't you?" Ethan stiffened. "I don't think so, ma'am." She smiled, not pressing. "Maybe I'm old, confusing faces and names, but that face, the way you carry a tray, it's familiar." He bowed slightly, gave a soft smile, and walked away. But he knew, no matter how carefully a mask is sewn, there comes a moment when it slips. And sometimes a single glance is all it takes to shake the whole disguise. That night, in the break room, Ethan pulled a small notebook from his apron pocket. Its leather cover was worn at the corners, held together with an old rubber band. He wrote, "Mara delivery in rain, no raincoat, no check-in, bruised cheek." Alda noticed. The lines were short, emotionless but heavier than 100 spoken words. This wasn't a diary. It was a testimony written from the inside. And Ethan knew that every entry he made was living evidence, a voice he once let go silent. As Dax walked by, he cast a sneering glance at the notebook. "We don't pay you to keep a journal, Eli." Ethan didn't respond, but his hand tightened around the notebook as if it were the last ember still burning inside him. Because in a place where every voice was muffled and every emotion expected to be handled privately, truth, if not written down, would be crushed. And that rainy night, when a soaked girl walked back in without being seen, without being asked, awakened something in Ethan. He was no longer just a bystander. He was a witness. And soon, he would be the one to speak. Late in the day, the cafe lights cast a soft amber glow across the dark wood counters and faded tiles. Dax suddenly summoned the entire staff to the counter. No warning, no clear reason. He stood with arms crossed, his smile wide but his eyes cold as steel. "We need to refresh the culture here," he said, his voice even and polished like a sales pitch. "New energy, new standards." People glanced at each other. No one spoke. "We'll be bringing in a few new faces, people who really want to grow here." He paused, just long enough. "And maybe some of the current ones will be better suited elsewhere." No names needed, but everyone felt like their own had just been silently laid on the chopping block. Dax clapped his hands, slicing through the heavy air. "No need to panic. If you're maintaining performance and attitude, you stay." Ethan scanned the room. Mara tightened her apron strap. A young barista dropped her gaze, nervously twisting her left wrist, a tell of anxiety. Ethan immediately understood what Dax was doing, shifting the edge of fear from something whispered to something declared, from unspoken to policy. But what shocked Ethan wasn't the words. It was the eyes of the young people around him. They weren't surprised. They simply withdrew like those who'd lived too long in fog to remember what sunlight used to feel like. That night, after the cafe closed, Ethan entered the small office in the back with a mop and cleaning spray in hand, just another closing shift worker. But each step he took carried a clear purpose. He bent down to clean the desk frame, slipping a tiny device beneath the monitor, a voice recorder the size of a fingertip. Click. The signal light blinked once, then went dark. It was ready. Ethan stood, his eyes catching the open screen just before it locked. And then, like a cold slap, the truth appeared. A spreadsheet in full view, listing names of employees, hours worked, flagged notes, and shorthand codes like late 0.5, no smile, tired shift, remove. No warnings, no formal system, no emails, just silent strike-throughs where livelihoods were being edited with a single keystroke. Dax walked in just as Ethan stepped back from the desk. "What are you doing?" he asked, half bored, half probing. Ethan held up a cracked milk frothing wand. "This is broken." Dax nodded as if swatting a fly, eyes returning to the screen. "Leave it. We'll deal with it tomorrow." Ethan turned away, heart pounding. He no longer had doubts. What was happening here wasn't just poor management. It was a silent purge, undocumented, untraceable until tonight. Because now, he had the copy. And this time, the cafe would have to listen to the voice of the one pulling the strings. In the storage area, Mara was on the phone, her voice dropping to a thread. "I'll try to be home early. I promise. Then she gently knocked on the office door. I need tomorrow off. My mom was admitted to the hospital this morning, just one shift. Dax didn't lift his eyes from the screen. Too late to ask. Mara bit her lip. I can make it up next week, or swap with someone. Dax cut in, voice cold as iron. If you can't be flexible, this may not be the place for you. Mara stood frozen. Are you saying I could be fired? For the first time, Dax looked directly at her. I'm saying we need people who are committed. Mara nodded, stepping back. Ethan watched from the hallway. Her shadow passed him by, shoulders squared, eyes dry. But to him, that wasn't a conversation. It was a warning, a sentence unspoken. And Ethan knew, one more step and everything would break open. But this time, he wasn't alone. Inside the inner pocket of his apron, a USB drive rested cold and silent. But inside it were Dax's words, the blueprint of quiet terminations, the list of those being replaced for lacking a smile or being too low energy. And in that moment, Ethan understood this wasn't just about Mara. This was a fight for all of them. The next morning, something felt different in the air at the cafe. Steam still hissed steadily from the espresso machine. The doorbell still jingled as customers entered, but there was an undercurrent in people's eyes, as if everyone sensed a storm approaching, though they couldn't tell from which direction. Mara sat at the corner table near the break room, a folded resignation letter resting quietly on the tabletop. Her face was calm, nearly still. Ethan walked in, his gaze briefly landing on the folded paper. You planning to turn it in today? Mara didn't look up. I should have turned it in last week. He nodded. Then give me 1 day. She gently shook her head. No one can change this place in a day, Ethan. But when he stepped closer, his voice softened yet steadied. Just 1 day, not to change everything, just to start. Mara looked at him for a long moment, then said nothing, only slipped the letter back into her pocket. At 10 a.m., the cafe hit its usual morning rush. The call bell rang from the counter, grinders hummed, cups clinked, receipts printed. Ethan stood at the heart of the space where every gaze could meet, where his voice could carry from the bar to the customer tables. Everyone, he said, just loud enough. A few heads turned. Mara glanced over, concern flashing in her eyes. I have something to say. Ethan took a deep breath and said clearly, My name isn't Eli. A heavy silence fell like a gust of wind. Customers paused mid-sip. Baristas froze, milk pitchers still in hand. My name is Ethan Vero. I'm the founder of the Ember Cup. Dax turned sharply from the register, his eyes flaring like he'd just been slapped. What kind of joke is this? He barked, louder than needed. Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his apron and pulled out an old, scratched name tag. Ethan Varo Founder, still etched in brass. A young staff member took half a step back, dropping the rag in her hand. Is that real? Someone whispered. Ethan approached the counter and laid down a small USB drive and a stack of printed papers. On them, names of employees with reduced hours, Dax's handwritten notes, codes like cut tired, late 2 min, no more energy. Silence. Then he pointed to the camera above the espresso bar. I've had access since my 2nd week. He lifted a small tablet, pressed play. Dax's voice filled the packed room. Mara's too soft. Cut her next month. Don't tell her. A sharp gasp. Mara raised her head, stunned. Ethan stepped forward, locking eyes with Dax, now pale, lips tight, eyes darting. But he said nothing more. He didn't have to, because in that moment, Alda, the elderly woman who always sat by the window, rose to her feet. I recorded that day, she said steadily, when Mara was sent into the rain, when he didn't say a single word of concern. The room froze. All eyes turned to Dax. No one defended him. No one pretended not to hear anymore. Dax didn't argue. He couldn't. Ethan looked at him and spoke calmly. I'm not firing you. Dax lifted his head slightly, confused. You'll stay, 30 days, no title, no privileges, regular shifts, regular duties. A quiet ripple moved through the cafe. Someone inhaled sharply, someone pressed their lips tight. You sowed fear, now try rebuilding trust. Ethan turned to the entire team. And to all of you from today forward, whoever stays, stays as a real part of this cafe. No fear, no silence, just honest work and fair treatment. A pause. Then he continued, this time gently. I want each of you to say one thing you've never dared to say before. Silence hung thick. Then slowly, Mara spoke first. I'm scared every time I walk through that door. Another voice followed. I used to love making coffee. Now I dread mornings. I stayed for unpaid evening shifts because I thought it was required. Each statement fell like a stone loosened from a dam, no bitterness, only truth. And for the first time in years, the cafe came alive. Not because the coffee tasted better, but because fear had finally been named. And the people once pushed to the margins were now beginning to stand at the center. That afternoon, the cafe remained open as usual, but the light inside seemed softer, warmer, not because the bulbs had changed, but because something heavy that had long weighed on the air had finally lifted. Ethan stood quietly behind the bar, observing his staff. There were no more downcast eyes, no more hesitant steps. Mara was making a cappuccino, her hands steady, posture upright. Her smile, though tired, was genuine. Ethan approached just as she placed the last cup on the tray. Can you come to the back for a moment? He asked. Mara nodded, not needing to ask why. In the break room corner, among the murmurs and footsteps, Ethan pulled out a thin envelope, plain, unbranded. Mara opened it. Her hands trembled slightly. Inside was a letter printed on smooth paper, headed in Italian, Accademia del Caffè Borsa di Studio Integral. Beneath it, her name. A full scholarship to Florence, home to one of Europe's premier barista training academies. Mara read it again, her eyes blurred. What is this? She whispered, her voice rough. Ethan answered gently but firmly. An old friend of mine runs that school. I told him about you, about how you've stayed standing when everything tried to break you. Mara said nothing. She clutched the letter, as if letting go would make it disappear. Ethan rested his hand on hers, slowly. You've carried more than anyone should have to, and you never let go. That deserves more recognition than any skill. Mara looked up. For the first time, her smile wasn't guarded, wasn't forced. It was real, simple, luminous, and steeped in quiet relief. I never thought I could leave without feeling guilty, she said. Ethan shook his head gently. You're not leaving. You're stepping into what you've always deserved. Moments later, he returned to the cafe floor. At the small announcement board next to the register, Ethan picked up a black marker and wrote clearly, from today on, every voice matters. Not a slogan, not a directive, just a promise made in the right place, at the right time, to the right people. The staff paused as they saw it. No one applauded, no one cheered. But in their eyes was a quiet recognition that for the first time in a long while, they no longer had to lie to themselves to come to work. A few days later, Mara stepped out of the cafe in the early morning light. Backpack slung over her shoulder, plane ticket in hand, her stride no longer hesitant. A coworker slipped her a small envelope. A regular customer handed her a hand-drawn card, a coffee cup with the words, "You made it warmer." Mara laughed, her eyes wet again. But this time, it was because she was leaving with her whole heart intact. Ethan stood inside, behind the glass, saying nothing, making no move to stop her. He simply watched quietly, like a keeper of the flame who had fulfilled his first task. Sunlight spilled through the window, casting long streaks across the worn floor, illuminating every scratch, every chipped tile. But now, those marks were no longer seen as flaws. They were the traces of a place coming back to life. And Ethan knew this journey wasn't over. But for the first time in a long while, he wasn't walking it alone. This cafe now was no longer just a space to serve drinks. It had become a place where human worth was restored. Every smile that returned, every glance reclaimed, was a heartbeat, thawing what had once been buried in ice. And in Ethan's eyes, one truth was unmistakable. The awakening had begun. A week after everything came to light, there were no more morning meetings filled with worn-out slogans. Instead, the staff arrived early, gathered around the bar, sharing warm peanut butter toast and the first espressos of the shift. Ethan no longer had to remind or signal anything. They were more natural now, more proactive. In the soft laughter of those early mornings, there was a quiet but resilient energy, the kind that only emerges when people are free to be themselves. Mara had already left, but inside her locker was a small note taped to the door. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness isn't weakness, it's courage at the right time." Dax remained. Just as Ethan had said, he wore the apron like everyone else, worked rotating shifts, relearned how to steam milk, clean tables, and take out the trash. His movements were awkward at first, sometimes impatient, but no one scolded. No one treated him coldly. No one flattered him either. They simply worked the right way. One busy afternoon, a latte was accidentally spilled at the bar. Instead of casting blame or glancing around, Dax silently grabbed a cloth and wiped it up. A young staff member handed him a new cup. No words were exchanged, but Ethan saw it in that quiet moment. Something had changed. Not redemption, but the beginning of learning again, with what he had once lost: humility. Ethan's notebook, once a private log of injustices and invisible cracks, now sat open on a shelf in the break room. Anyone could write in it, not to accuse, but to record acts of kindness they witnessed from coworkers, from customers, even from themselves. They called it the Ember Log. A night shift employee wrote the first line: "Dax washed every single baking tray yesterday without being asked." Another entry read, "Customer named Brian tipped Ella and left a folded note. Thanks for the smile this morning, I really needed it." These scribbled lines, messy but sincere, became fuel for the atmosphere no control needed, no rewards, just the power of being seen. Ethan spent more time out on the floor not to supervise, but to observe. He relearned how to listen, not with his ears, but with his eyes, through the air, in the rhythm of each person's movement. What moved him most wasn't the thanks directed at him, it was hearing a barista tell a new hire on their first shift, "You don't have to be perfect here, just be real." One afternoon, with few customers around, Ethan looked out the cafe window, where golden sunlight stretched long across the old brick sidewalk. A little girl, maybe 7, stood outside holding her father's sleeve, eyes fixed on a pastry in the display. The man hesitated, then gently led her away. Ethan softly called to a staff member, "Bring her a cookie. Mark it as pre-door guest." The staff member nodded immediately, no further explanation needed. And that, more than anything, was what Ethan had always dreamed of. A place that didn't just sell coffee, but warmed people with small gestures, quiet, unnoticed, perfectly timed. He knew well, the Ember Cup would never be perfect. But it was breathing again. And in every breath there was the warmth of people freed from old roles, stepping into something new, not carrying fear, but carrying the belief that if a cafe could change, so could the world. All it takes is someone willing to begin. That morning, sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting soft rays across the worn wooden grains of the cafe. The smell of freshly roasted coffee lingered in the air, mingling with laughter spilling from the corner table where 2 employees were swapping stories about a customer who had forgotten their phone, too busy chatting with the barista. That atmosphere made Ethan pause for a moment before stepping into the day. On the small message board near the register, someone had added in white chalk beneath the slogan he once wrote, "Every voice matters, and every person is part of the flame." Ethan stood behind the bar, fingertips resting on his morning cappuccino. The milk swirled gently in the cup, smooth as a breath. Across the room, Dax was cleaning the windows. No one had asked him to, but lately he was often the first to arrive, taking on the toughest tasks and the last to leave. No one called it redemption. It didn't need to be. Because sometimes a person doesn't need forgiveness, only the chance to walk forward differently. The ember log had thickened noticeably, no longer filled with solitary notes Ethan once scribbled in silence. It now brimmed with encouraging messages, small stories of kindness, and handwritten reflections that felt surprisingly tender. Ethan read through them, sometimes just to remind himself that what gives a place its soul isn't the signage or the recipes, but its people. That afternoon, he arrived at the cafe earlier than usual. One of the employees handed him a small package wrapped in craft paper and tied with twine. No sender. Ethan opened it. Inside was an old photo, him and Lena, each holding a coffee cup standing in the cafe on opening day. On the back, a handwritten note in delicate script. You kept your promise. I'm still here, in every drop that's warm. Ethan lingered after the evening shift, sitting in the now quiet cafe. He looked around not to check, but to remember. The windows once dulled by dust now sparkled. The bar, once cold, now buzzed with friendly calls. Names that were once just shift schedules had become real people. He reached into his wallet, opened a hidden flap, and pulled out the photo he had carried throughout his return, also the one he held the day Lena cut the ribbon on opening day. He placed it on the counter beside a small vase of freshly arranged flowers. Then, with steady handwriting, he added one final line to the log. The ember cup, never just coffee. The next day, Ethan no longer stood behind the counter. He simply walked by, looking in through the front window where sunlight fell gently on Mara's face in the small framed photo near the entrance, marked with the caption, Florence 2026. A customer placed a hand on his shoulder as they exited. Thank you for bringing this place back to life. Ethan simply nodded, not out of modesty, but because he knew the one who brought this place back wasn't him alone. It was every voice once silenced, every hand that worked in the quiet, every step that returned not for a paycheck, but for hope. As the final screen fades in, only his voice remains low, steady, and certain. Machines can break, coffee beans can burn, people can make mistakes. But dignity, that's the one thing that cannot be negotiated. And if there's anything worth preserving, it's the kindness shown when no one is watching. The screen darkens. A single white line appears, small but unmistakably clear. Ethan still has 2 cafes left to return to, and the fire of kindness still has work to do. This story is not just a journey to expose a domineering manager, but more importantly, it's a testament to this truth. A workplace only truly comes alive when the people within it are heard and allowed to be themselves. Ethan didn't return to reclaim power, but to reignite the values that had once been lost in the cold pursuit of productivity. If you believe that every act of kindness begins with the courage to speak up, then like and subscribe to join us in the journey to restore dignity in the workplace. And don't forget to leave a comment with 3 words. Speaking takes courage. Because sometimes a single voice at the right moment can shift the direction of an entire team.